This podcast is for educational and entertainment purposes only. Nothing stated on it, either by its hosts or any guests, is to be construed as psychological, medical, or legal advice. You are listening to Adoptees On, the podcast where adoptees discuss the adoption experience. I'm Haley Radke. Mirella Stoyanova is our guest today. And I don't normally say this, but this was one of my favorite conversations in recent memory. Mirella is a therapist and writer, and her insights dazzled me. We talk about her experience being adopted at age 5 and what coming to America from Bulgaria was like. We discuss the what-ifs of kinship adoption, living in the both and of grief and gratitude, and she shares an insight that stops me in my tracks. Do adoptees reflect an existential crisis back to society? We mentioned violence and suicide at multiple points during this conversation, so please take care when deciding when to listen. Before we get started, I wanted to personally invite you to join our Patreon adoptee community today over on adopteeson.com/community, which helps support you and the show to support more adoptees around the world. We wrap up with some recommended resources, and as always, links to everything we'll be talking about today are on the website adopteeson.com. Let's listen in. I am so pleased to welcome to Adoptees On, Mirella Stoyanova. Hello, Mirella. So good to talk with you.
Hi, Haley. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I've been looking forward to it for months.
Me too. Okay, the first time I took note of you was at the Adoptee Literary Festival, where you read a piece in the sizzle reel and you were so captivating. I immediately went to my guest list and wrote your info down. So I'd love it if you would start by sharing your story with us.
Oh my goodness. Well, where to begin? I'm a writer. I'm a therapist. I always like to say I'm a recovering perfectionist. But
I say that too.
Yeah? Do you?
That's so funny. I've said that for years. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I'm also an international adoptee, and I worked in the field. Well, I was a crisis worker for the 5 years after graduate school. And then I became licensed as a clinical social worker. So I'm a practicing therapist in the Seattle area. And I have experience working with individuals and families in pretty much every context you can think of, from acute trauma to sort of the outpatient mental health that I do now. And I'm also a mother of a 2-year-old son, and I live, as I said, in the Seattle area with my husband and my son.
So you have one of those unique circumstances, because I talk to a lot of infant adoptees. And hold on a second. They're adults now, but were placed for adoption as an infant. But in your circumstances, an intervention really was necessary. Do you care to share that part of your childhood?
I was adopted at 5 years old. I was actually speaking with a friend this morning who was also an older adoptee and a fan of the show. And he was like, represent the older adoptees. So here I am. Here I am representing. You know who you are. I was adopted from Bulgaria to the United States at 5 years old. My parents had died a year and a half before, in the very, very early 90s. And my grandmother, who was caring for me, happened to be dying of cancer. So she had to figure out what was going to become of my future. And the country where I was born, Bulgaria, was newly democratic. There was an effort in the country to expatriate the Muslim minority who were Turkish and who, from her perspective, my grandmother's perspective, looked very much like me. And Eastern Europe was a dangerous place for a newly orphaned child. So she found my adoptive parents about a year before I left. And while she entertained the idea of me being adopted by various families, pretty early on, she decided that I would go with them. And of course, the myth from the adoption side is that, the story goes that my parents had three boys, biological children, and they were trying for a girl. They were considering trying for a girl, and they had friends of theirs who also had three boys and were trying for a girl. And instead of getting a girl, they got pregnant with twin boys. And so the story is that that was when my parents decided they wanted to adopt. And they had tried to adopt another little girl from Bulgaria before me, who was actually in an orphanage. But her birth mother came to reclaim her because she had not consented to adoption. And this little girl was there because her mother couldn't afford to take care of her. And in my case, I came to the United States with an entire history that I remembered pretty well. I came here with a lot of grief, unresolved grief and trauma, and a lot of questions that went unanswered for many years. And I guess that's where the story ends, right? From the narrative, the non-adoptee narrative. Anyway, it was happily ever after from there.
Sure, I'm sure it was. What a gift. So in my research, I think I understood correctly that your birth mother was also an adoptee herself.
She was.
Okay.
My birth mother was adopted, and I've always wanted, but have never been able to search for I've been sort of discouraged from searching for my biological maternal grandparents because the system, the government in Bulgaria is notoriously bureaucratic. I mean, like they shut down over the summer just because it's summer kind of thing. And it takes a long time to get anything done. But recently, a woman who's Bulgarian who had someone in her family was adopted reached out to me, and she shared that the Bulgarian court system recently has unsealed the records of adoptions in the country. And depending on, whether you can present them with the right information, they may be able to unseal the record. So I don't know that I can, as the daughter of my deceased birth mother, but I think that will certainly be, a question that I ask and explore in the coming years for sure.
Interesting. So your grandmother was her adoptive mother, and she also adopted you once your parents had died?
She did.
So you're double.
Yeah. Yes, I'm a second generation adoptee.
And twice adopted.
Yes. And twice adopted. Yes. And I'm half Iraqi, half Bulgarian. My parents died by murder-suicide. My grandmother, she felt it would be unconscionable for me to be adopted by my paternal family, but my paternal family did seek out adoption. In fact, they put in the paperwork for adoption. But
were they also in Bulgaria?
With the Bulgarian government. Yeah. And there was a real effort to prevent me from being raised by them because of, I think, what were very natural and normal, but also from the perspective of my paternal family, like very hurtful reasoning, which was, that I could be re-traumatized because I witnessed the event of my parents' deaths. And, the thought of me being raised by people who resembled my birth father didn't seem like a good idea. And of course, the blind spot was I also resemble my birth father.
Mm.
And so for many years, I realized this is being recorded, so people won't see me, but I even wanted to bring you just to show you, I have this, it's a photo album and it's got about 30 pictures in it. And for about 20 years, that's all I had, as far as my awareness and connection to anyone who looked like me.
You have this other unique perspective of having worked in, I'll call it child welfare, for a period of time. And uniquely, your parents were unable to parent, your grandmother unable to parent as she passed quite shortly after you were adopted. We have people ask us all the time, right? Like, is adoption even necessary? What would you do? And you have a very different vantage point than someone like me, who's an infant adoptee, who I think it was unnecessary. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think in my case, it was maybe also unnecessary in some ways, although having been raised and benefited from certain advantages that I wouldn't have otherwise, I see the nuance of that perspective, and I'm glad for the life that I've had. I wouldn't say I'm entirely grateful. I think there's a lot of complexity in that. But Bulgarian law says that a child is only eligible for foreign adoption after they've been offered for adoption to 3 Bulgarian families and anyone in their biological family. And that regulation was not followed in my case. And so, okay, it might not have been entirely necessary for me. It was necessary for me to be adopted. Absolutely. I needed to be raised by someone. And, the alternative of going to an orphanage was certainly not something that my grandmother wanted for me. But was it necessary for me to come to the United States? Was it necessary for me to be adopted cross-culturally? I'm not sure. As a former child welfare worker, I went to graduate school. The reason why I went to graduate school originally was because I was going to use that as a foundation for going to get my legal degree and doing global child welfare policy advocacy. And so my personal opinion, which is informed by years of research and also on the ground experience, which was, initially how I became a social worker, is that we have to support families, first of all, to stay together in whatever capacity they can when a child truly becomes adoptable. Obviously, the existence of adoption points to insufficiencies in our infrastructure, social infrastructure to support children and families, right? But then, if a child is adopted or placed in foster care, we have to work to make sure that family is supported on a community level and that the infrastructure is there for that child to be raised within the context of a connected and loving and supportive environment where they have themselves as they are sort of truly reflected back to them. And that's not the case for so many of us, regardless of what our stories are.
So we're going to live in the both and for a moment.
Yeah.
And if you had access to, let's call it trauma-informed care at the time, because, I haven't commented, but, I'm so sorry for, the horrific way that your parents died and the impact that that's had, of course, on your life. I'm very sorry. And so if you had that sort of trauma-informed care, which I don't know, was that available? You're younger than me. To go with your paternal family, do you think, like, looking back, like, are you like, I don't know, like, it's so complex. Like, I get it. I get why people made the choices they made and weren't sure about
Mhm.
this and that.
Yeah.
Do you wish that's the direction they would have gone?
I see it both ways because I see the harm that it caused within that family, my paternal biological relatives who I reconnected with after the end of my first year of graduate school. I see it both ways. There was a giant rupture in their in the in the fabric of their family. And I don't know. I don't think actually, because there's also a really complex conversation about patriarchal violence, which is baked into not only my story, but the story of adoption. And also, there's like a cultural component of that, like, I'm not sure could have been overcome. I want to believe that it could have, but I don't know. And I like to stay in that place of not knowing because it allows me to connect in ways that I think I wouldn't otherwise be able to. So I think that the answer to your question is probably not. um, when I was adopted, by the time I was adopted, I'd had a year and a half of sort of being cared for by who could care for me. I went to school at kind of an elite boarding school, preschool in Sofia. And so I sort of spent time going to the school. And then when I wasn't at that school, if my grandmother was feeling well enough, she would take me, but oftentimes she wasn't. And so I spent time with others who were sort of designated to make sure that I wasn't sort of like falling through the cracks. So I arrived with, kind of a year and a half's worth of grief work that I was behind on and trauma recovery that I was behind on. And I actually had the very good fortune of working with, at the time, one of the top attachment and adoption therapists in the Seattle area, Deborah Gray, who's written the book Attaching and Adoption. But at that time, I still needed a lot. And, given the family that I grew up in and their, I think sort of the lack of awareness of like what it would entail to adopt someone at an older age with those sets of issues, it wasn't going to be enough, unless they were going to be able to do their own work, understand what's unsettling about having an adoptee who's in pain, who has a story like the story that I had.
What was it like to come to the US? Here's your new white family with three big older brothers. I
Yeah.
mean, that I can't imagine, like, did they come to get you? Did you go on the plane and they met you here? I mean, what happened?
Well, without telling the story itself, what I will say is that it was an exercise in cognitive dissonance, a 15 to 20-year exercise. And in some ways, it still continues because, on one hand, there's the story that that family creates about who you are as an adoptee joining their family. And on the other hand, as a person who was adopted at age 5, I had my own set of memories and feelings and thoughts about my experience that were not always congruent with the narrative that my family wanted to tell about my belonging to them. And, I experienced that at multiple levels. I experienced that at the level of, I used to always write this in my journal. I would say, I had a life before you knew me. I had a life before you knew me. Like I wanted them to know that, right? Which didn't totally get honored. There's a lot of pain that like they didn't have the capacity to recognize, and a lot of like just not even pain, but like my identity, they didn't have the capacity to recognize. But then there was also the issue of my ethnic and cultural difference. And I am racially ambiguous. People look at me and the first words out of their mouth are, "What are you?" Which is very, it becomes funny the more you are on the receiving end of it, but funny, not funny, right? And, you look at me, I have curly hair and tan skin, and, how I move through the world is as someone who is ethnically different. And actually, I've been misraced. So it's partially also racial difference. And then if you have a family who's reflecting back to you that they're just looking at you because you're beautiful, they're just, there's nothing wrong. They're not treating you any different. We don't treat you any different. It becomes really confusing and difficult to know how to be in the world.
I have a couple of thoughts. One is for families who collect another person because of their gender. That's weird.
Yeah.
But common. And the other thing, as you were talking, you referenced this in a few of your different pieces, but I'm just going to read from your piece in Write or Die, Loss Side Effects May Include. You say, "My new mother says she can't compete with an angel. But no matter how hard I try, I can't forget the mother who died. So I do not invoke her memory in the presence of my new mother, who is also jealous that I have taken to my new father instead of her." Are you comfortable talking about that a little bit? Or does that say it all?
Let me think about this. My adoptive mother, she died a year and a half ago. And, it's so funny because even though people pass from our lives, those relationships continue. And in so many ways, ours has. But what I can say about her is that she had her own set of expectations about what having a daughter would mean that were created through her own unresolved childhood needs, unmet childhood needs. And when I didn't fill those needs, and of course I couldn't because I came as a complete human being, child, it was very disappointing. And she had a lot of negative feelings about that she directed toward me in so many ways throughout my upbringing. And my mother also happened to be someone who had some mental health issues that meant she sort of operated at two speeds. And so how those expectations got refracted into our relationship was very fraught. I was very afraid of saying and doing the wrong things, constantly felt like I was disappointing her or that I could never live up to her expectations, because also the other side of it is her longing never could be sated. What is the saying? That we can never get enough of what we don't need. You know, she was looking for answers in the entirely wrong place. She was putting that on a child. So, yeah, and now, I look at it with a little bit more complexity because I am a mother myself. And I also recognize that so much of what was scary to me about my mother was the life in her. Very early on, the scope of what was possible in a life was made very apparent. I witnessed a murder-suicide. So, I was very afraid of some of those natural and normal parts of what make life life. It was intense emotions, the uncertainty of relationships, and even just engaging in life in a way that meant you were taking risks. I didn't want to do that. And that was her all the way. That's who she was. She was, flying by the seat of her pants and scared me.
So she passed just after you became a mother.
She did.
How's your perspective changed on that since having your son?
Yeah. Well, one of the things is that, motherhood has completely shifted the way I experience myself as an adoptee. So my son is 2 now, and there were sort of other things going on at the time, but I was really thinking a lot about, both through my writing work and my work as a therapist, sort of what makes the experience of being an adoptee universal. And I don't know how it registered or when necessarily but there was one sort of particular moment in the recent past where I was viewing my son. I was like, I don't know, my husband and I, we both work from home, and each day we're, walking around the house, we come into the kitchen or places where my son is with the person who cares for him during the day. And it's always so hard. It's always so hard to leave him. And there was a moment where I was reflecting on the pain of leaving him, and, how he cries out for me, and how that pain it's sort of reciprocal. Like, he's crying out for me because we're separated, and it's really uncomfortable for me to be separated from him or to hear him crying somewhere else. And I think I stumbled onto this insight that his pain of being separate is not unlike the pain that I experienced as a newly orphaned child who was taken from, who lost my mother and, was taken from my community, my country. There's a pain of separation there. And shortly after realizing that, I sort of started looking around and thinking to myself, that is the pain that I feel with my son, but that's also the pain I feel, in other relationships, in other facets of my life, that pain of separation, that pain of disconnect. And it was a revelation for me, because what I thought made me so different as an adoptee and as someone who's experienced multiple iterations of capital T trauma in my life is actually the thing that binds me with all humans. And I might argue all living things. Right. And so I've really been reflecting on that. And, I was preparing for this talk, and I listened to the most recent of your conversations with Pam Cardano in the healing series that you do. And you asked a question about, like, why do you think, like, maybe people who are like adoptive parents or non-adoptees or muggles, I think, as she likes to call them, like, aren't willing to like look at, I think you were talking about like the nothing place, right?
Yes.
And I truly think that as adoptees, we're mirroring back the physical reality of an existential problem that other people who are not adopted will do anything most of the time to get out of thinking about. We have entire industries, the wellness industry, the dating industry, the anti-aging industry, that their whole thing is like to keep you from, or maybe to help you feel more in control and to keep you from thinking about the reality that, you are born alone, you die alone. Sorry to be so uplifting here, but you are alone. You are alone. And no amount of things you can buy are going to, keep you from that reality. And as adoptees, as people who are, system involved, children in the foster care system who age out into adulthood, who've had these really nuanced experiences, we're reflecting back a reality that is very uncomfortable for people to sit with. And so I think this narrative of like sad story with a happy ending is more palatable. Then you became a part of something. Then you belonged again. You were alone and now you're not. We're all alone. We're all alone. And it's okay. That's part of it. Because the other thing is like how beautiful that we keep reaching for connection. How beautiful that we're still reaching for each other and doing the work of iterating in what ways we can that we are not alone.
Mirella, I think you just connected something for me that I've thought about for years. You mentioned cognitive dissonance earlier. This is the thing that pisses me off so much, is that cognitive dissonance. Oh my gosh, I'm so glad you were adopted. Oh my gosh, I love the reunion story, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, I've always had that gap in like, I don't get it. Why don't people connect that for there to be the happy reunion, then there is the separation? And I think you nailed it there. I think that's what it is. We have to cover up the fear middle of like, we can't be alone. We can't be with ourselves.
It's a deeply existential concern, bordering on spiritual. And people don't want to think about it because it's uncomfortable to be faced with the reality of that truth of our experience. And so that dominant narrative of adoption, that's what we want to reach for. And I had the unique experience recently. I wrote something very brief, and it was in an attempt to connect with other adoptees, but it was posted on Facebook or something. And sort of the reaction to this like brief snippet of my story was, there were some beautiful and kind comments, and there were some really kind of atrocious, but also predictable comments that reflected back something about the discomfort that stirred up in whoever it was that wrote what they did. And a lot of it was like, so nothing positive happened, so you're not grateful. Some of it was go back to your own country, which was an interesting one for me because I hold a United States passport. So there's that. But I was really struck by what it reflected, which is like, we as a society are not really set up. There isn't an emotional infrastructure for understanding and sitting with the discomfort of cognitive dissonance, that both and, that two things can be true at once, that level of complexity and nuance. And it really creates a lot of pain for people in relationships, personal pain. For me, I came into adulthood with a lot of relational disconnect, in part because I had no idea who I was. It was so uncomfortable. And this is a common like adoptee story, is like we're trying to fit in. So we do everything we can. And then as a result, we don't know who we are. We have little self-acceptance. So we can't really understand who we are in relation to other people. And a lot of that is like learning to be okay with who I am. And if as an adoptee, you're straddling all of these lines, someone is telling you who you are, and that doesn't fit with how you know yourself or what your experience is, it's going to create a lot of relational disconnect.
Well, and I mean, you say you're a therapist, so you can tell me, and I want to hear about how you came to choose that profession. But as you're talking through those things, I think, yeah, and ultimately, of course, adoptees are human, and the human experience is to have pain and suffering and all those things. And for us, like, I really feel like the, quote unquote healing journey, this is going to sound so cliche, but, like, just go with me, is literally learning to love ourselves. And when we have that big black hole carved out and you say, love yourself, that's the fix. It's like, okay, but how do you love the black hole it's a void? I can't see it. I can't, it feels impossible to overcome that.
Yeah. I think if we were to like go deeper on that, which I don't think it's cliche, I think it needs some conveyance of what is it that we're looking at. You can't love or accept yourself if you don't know who you are. And whatever that means to you, whether it's I don't have the life experience to understand who the self is that is navigating this world, or I'm confused because somebody told me who I was or who I should be, and that doesn't match with how I move through the world. But if we don't know who we are, we don't know where we end and where other people begin. We're not then able to form healthy boundaries or relationships with other people because everything is a negotiation. And, how many adoptees have you spoken with, Haley, who, have talked about like being chameleons, right? Like some people say it's our superpower, and it was certainly mine. And sometimes I feel myself pulled to like try to figure that out, and be that version of who, someone is expecting me to be. But I do think the healing work comes from uncovering who we are truly. And for so many adoptees, that question is complicated by not having access to information. And whether you need that information or not to really know who you are, it's like this whole other conversation that we could go into probably great depth about. But unless you can really do that work of like articulating to yourself a version of who you are that you can accept, it's going to be really hard to see the difference between who it is I truly am and how I move through the world and the stories that other people have about who I am and how I move through the world.
What led you to becoming a therapist? And I think now, after people hearing you with your insights here, they're going to be lining up.
I didn't know I wanted to become a therapist until I kind of topped out in the child welfare work that I was doing and realized that no amount of advancing through that goal that I'd had for so many years was going to be satisfying for me. It was sort of like recognizing that, that I was in so many ways trying to be someone I was not. And I really, more than anything, wanted to be who I was, right? Like that was where I was in my own sort of healing journey at the time. And
Because you also had the idea of going on to law, right?
yeah,
And so that didn't pan out, or I don't know.
well, no, I actually just course corrected.
Okay.
And some of it was that I went through a health crisis in my 20s. I withdrew from topical steroids used to treat childhood eczema for many, many years. And that was like a 4.5 year long process that involved basically my body just like completely rebelling against what I was trying to do, which was like clear it from my system. And it was at that time that I was like, what is going to make me happy? What is it like if nothing changes? Like if I'm in this physical pain that I've been in for these many number of years, if nothing changes for the rest of my life, like how am I going to be with myself? What is it that I need to like live a satisfying and meaningful life? And at that point, I'd actually been pursuing my clinical licensure for 3 years without really having an intention of sitting for the exam. And I was in my life outside of work, I was reading theoretical texts about psychology and healing and all these things. So that was the point at which I was like, yeah, no, I think I want to become a therapist. And about a year later, I went and I worked at Seattle Children's in the inpatient psych unit and studied under a really wonderful behavioralist who's done a lot of great work for adolescents on mood management type stuff. But then I also had this, really extensive background and interest in like existential and Buddhist psychology. And that happened to lend really well to the work I do as a therapist. So I then opened my private practice in 2018, and I've been seeing clients ever since.
Amazing. Well, thank you for your service to the folks that need your guidance. I mean, I know you work with adoptees also, in addition to muggles, I'll call them.
Yeah.
And you have an expertise in racial reclamation as well, and can speak to those things too. Is there anything that we didn't really talk about yet that you want to make sure that you share with listeners?
Yeah, it's an expertise in racial reclamation or racial conscientization. There's also the trauma recovery piece that I do, and also working with folks like around perfectionism. I work with a lot of like high performers who struggle with feelings of, as it happens, inadequacy. So, that's an area where I do a lot of sort of in-depth work. I have notes. I haven't looked at them today. I feel like we touched on so much.
We did. We touched on some really deep things that I didn't anticipate us talking about, but I think it was so impactful.
I'm glad. I have, the two books that I was thinking about, what I would want to recommend to anyone on their own journey, and some of the, foundational texts and how I approach healing in general, but also, this stemmed from my own sort of healing journey.
Yeah, you go first. What are the books you want to recommend to us?
Yeah, I've got Complex PTSD from Surviving to Thriving, Pete Walker's work on complex PTSD, which I feel would be really relevant for this audience, as well as a very beautiful book called Healing Through the Dark Emotions: The Wisdom of Grief, Fear, and Despair. And it's written by Miriam Greenspan, who is the daughter of concentration camp survivors and has a lot of really solid and beautiful work around, how we can relate skillfully to difficult emotions.
When you sent me the complex PTSD book, I looked it up and I thought, oh my goodness, this would be so helpful for people to work through, especially if they feel that or have been diagnosed with PTSD or CPTSD. It's great. Thank you so much for recommending that. So your writing is really incredible. And I told you right at the start, your reading on that sizzle reel is what just captivated me. And so, I've read all the pieces that you've got publicized on your website, and we'll link to those in the show notes. But I just feel like your writing is it's reflective, it's evocative. I mean, you can hear how, Mirella, you shared with us today. And I feel like you write in that just such a thoughtful way. So I know you have a memoir you're querying around. So, let's get this girl signed, people.
Yeah, I wrote a book about a crisis I faced when I got engaged in 2020. And I couldn't shake the feeling that I was sort of living a double life, or a life that was, written according to what somebody else wanted. And I realized that I needed to reckon with my past or risk losing my relationship and pretty much everything that by that point I had worked really hard to build. It was like over a decade of healing and self-work. And I was in crisis thinking that, if I really looked at my relationship, I was going to blow it all to pieces. And so that's what the memoir is about. And hopefully, right now I'm the thing about writing and pursuing traditional publication is you realize, you write and then you rewrite and then you rewrite again and you think you're done, but you're really reaching some kind of threshold of more nuanced understanding. And I'm currently revising again to take my book back out and requery it in 2026.
Okay.
So,
well, we're all cheering you on.
Thank you.
I'm going to link to these pieces, but the one that really spoke to me was loss. Side effects may include. And then you wrote in Business Insider, which I'll tell you, it scared me a little bit, and I practiced earlier. I was adopted as a child by an American family. They still can't pronounce my name correctly. Girl, when you wrote Mirella, I was like, I grew up on Anne of Green Gables, okay? Mm-hmm. And so then that stuck in my head, and I was like, dear God, that I cannot say that today.
You didn't.
So I hope I did okay. Anyway.
And I think I've probably scared a lot of people, but honestly, it was just sort of an honest expression of exasperation I felt at having spent 18 years of my life trying to ask for my name to be pronounced correctly. And with some individuals in my family, it's been harder than with others. But names are so reflective of who we are. They're an expression of identity. And when somebody, even if someone isn't saying your name right, when they try, it's about conveying that you're seen. And we all want to be seen.
Oh, yeah. I totally agree. Okay. And so my assistant, actually anyone that's worked for me, that is one of the very first things we talk about is I'm like, every guest's name is going to be spelled correctly. And I'm not going to see any name spelled incorrectly. And so I always make this point of making sure I say people's names correctly, but I know I don't always get it quite right. But it's so important. I totally agree. And it, to the degree where, I have multiple friends who've changed their name as their identity reclamation project.
Yeah, I have as well.
Yeah.
Stoyanova is it's my pre-adoptive middle name and the family name of my grandmother and my birth mother. Yes. So of course it's complicated because there's like the whole Eastern European, like Bulgarian nomenclature thing, but I ended up reclaiming that, and I have my married name, but I write under my pre-adoptive name.
I love
is
that.
very significant.
Yeah, totally. So please go and check out Mirella's writing. Mirella's writing. God.
There you go. It's okay. It's okay.
It's not hard. I don't know why I'm struggling.
It's not about saying it right. It's about the intention.
So we'll link to those in the show notes, but where can we connect with you and cheer you on in your search for finding this publisher?
Well, I am on Instagram. I love connecting with folks there because it's sort of a place that, exists at the cross section of my personal and professional lives. But I also right now have a website for my writing work that will in the new year also be a website for my therapy practice as well. And right now it has the link to my therapy practice, but it's just a writing focused page, and that's mirellastoyanova.com.
Perfect. We'll link to those both in the show notes so you can click through easily and follow. Thank you so much. What an honor to speak to you today. I really enjoyed our time together.
I'm so honored to be here. I was so happy when you asked, and thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure to be here.
Okay, chat. First of all, did you know that's what the cool kids talk like these days? Chat. Like they just call everybody chat. I do it and my kids, roll their eyes at me. Anyway, okay, chat. I want to know what you think about Mirella's insight with us reflecting back to culture, this idea that there's a fear of being alone in our existence and our complete disconnection from our biological origins shows them you too could be alone. I want to know what you think about that, and come to Instagram, put it in the comments for this episode. I'm fascinated by it. I have thought about this nonstop since we had this conversation, and I think she's onto something. So I think these ideas that keep coming out, the nothing place, this existential crisis theory, these are really worth talking about because they help us understand ourselves better, and they help us talk about adoption in a way that the general population can understand. Because isn't that what we want? We want them to understand the truth of our experiences, the pain, the both and, the trauma, all of those things. Because if they understood us better, perhaps we could lessen the amount of unnecessary adoptions. Perhaps we could halt them altogether. Perhaps we could have more supports for adult adoptees, for current growing up adoptees. Imagine what a world. Anyway, come to the comments and let us know. And if you are listening to this around when it airs, I just want to remind you, I'm going to be in New York City to attend the Adoptee Film Fest. Also celebrating with Sullivan Summer the launch of her chapbook, Into the World. And it sounds like that's the name of her chapbook. Performance Anxiety is the name of her chapbook. And so I'll be there celebrating with her, and I would love to meet you. We would love to see you there. So we'll have links to those events in the show notes. That's happening in November 2025. And of course, if you're listening in the future, we missed you. Perhaps we'll see you next year. Okay. Thank you so much for listening. Let's talk again very soon.